Have you seen cabinets of curiosities? Because today we're making a display table full of odd things. I'm starting with this vintage 112 scale display table that has acrylic sides and an acrylic removable top. The inside is lined with velvet. I'm going for an old creepy vibe, so I'm trying to remove the velvet inside because it looks too brand new and perfect. This thing was glued down like a mofo, so I couldn't remove it, so instead I'm scraping the velvet texture off of the surface using the flat end of a ruler. I made multiple passes with the ruler from different directions to shave all of the texture off of the velvet, and I'm left with this red flocking I can use in a future project. With the fuzz removed, the velvet now looks like aged red linen. I didn't use my heat gun to try to soften the glue to remove the red velvet because I didn't want to damage the acrylic side windows, but now I'm popping them out anyway because I want to refinish the wood a bit. On camera, the wood looks a lot darker, more like walnut or ebony, but in real life it's pretty shiny red. I'm not a fan of a mahogany wood tone, so I'm taking some fine sandpaper to remove the shine from the surface. I'm not trying to take this down to the bare wood, I'm just adding some tooth to the surface so I can add a finish to change the tone of the wood. There was some glue residue left behind from when I popped out the windows, so I used a combination of the ruler and the sandpaper to remove that as well so the future glue will stick nicely. I'm removing all the sanding dust using a damp paper towel, making sure to get into all of the nooks and crannies so the new finish and the new glue will sit nicely on the surface and stick. In some of the areas, I intentionally sanded a little bit deeper to add some wear for age. These are the pale areas you see around the very edges. I'm using antique wax from Waverly to go over the entire table to knock down some of the paler spots where I sanded through to the wood and to change the tone of the red. I've used this product many times to soak into raw wood and removed the excess, but it worked for this application as well, going over a finished piece. This time, instead of removing the excess while it was wet, I removed it while it was dry. You can use an acetone-based glue like Beacon 3-in-1 or Fabri-Tac to add the panels back, but I'm using some white glue to glue in the acrylic. Application is made a whole lot easier with this tiny precision tip bottle, but you could also apply it with a toothpick. Whatever you do, don't use super glue because it can fog up your acrylic and really screw things up. This looks pretty crazy right now, and it took several hours to dry, but it did dry clear and it's hardly noticeable. To fill my cabinet, I'm starting with these dried up twigs I broke off some branches in the yard. I think this middle piece looks like a hoof, so I'm leaning into that by adding paint to the branch and dipping it into some flocking. Flocking is really teeny tiny fibers. You can get it to stick to a surface either by using wet paint or glue. You can use it to create a velvet texture or to mimic fur on miniature animals. I think these may be dried up buds at the end of the branch, but I'm making them look more like a hoof or a foot by adding a small amount of black dry brushing. This took me 2 seconds to make and looks so delightfully creepy. I chose these next two pieces of stick because I thought they looked like bones. To me, the larger stick looks more like a femur with a ball joint at the end, and the little stick looks like a teeny tiny bone from a critter, or perhaps a human. I painted the bone white, and now I'm capping off the end with some yellow ochre and some darker paint. I want this to look like bone marrow. My bones don't look very convincing because they have no shine, so I added a layer of gloss Mod Podge. I've been hoarding these paper butterflies inside of a pill capsule for a few years now. I'm finally ready to use them in a project, but first I'd like to add a few details to the two smaller butterflies. These two have minimal detail, so I'm dotting on some white paint with my Dollar Tree ball stylus and adding some turquoise color to the left butterfly. I'm adding the tiniest bit of shine to each of the butterflies using matte Mod Podge. It's not entirely matte, so there is a little bit of sheen. Next, I'm transforming what's probably a frog garden ornament into a bit of taxidermy. I believe this frog is made of ceramic and it's missing its front left foot, so I'm adding some black paint to cover the white edges. I went a little too far and covered the entire frog in black paint. I used this really thin black primer that's meant to be put into an airbrush, so it stuck really well. It wouldn't come off with just water, so I had to remove the excess with rubbing alcohol. Since I had to get so aggressive, I removed original layers of paint and also snapped off one of the feet. I used some Beacon 3-in-1, which I refer to as cold hot glue, to glue it back on. There are some very white areas where I removed the original paint, so I'm dabbing on some brown acrylic paint to cover it up. The paint was having trouble sticking to the super smooth surface, so I'm adding some ultra matte sealer, which will create a tiny bit of texture for acrylic paint to stick to. I'm coming back in with the brown to cover up more of the white. The frog doesn't look dead enough, so I'm using my Dollar Tree ball stylus and some white acrylic paint to dab the eyes. I'm going for that creepy white smoky eye effect you see on dead fish. I think it's quite possible the color of the frog was better before I did my multi-step fixing multiple mistakes layered paint job, but I do like the white eyes. We're shifting from dead animals to artifacts. I have a 1/12 scale black miniature pipe I'm making look more interesting by adding some antique gold rub and buff. I like to apply rub and buff with a Q-tip whenever I can because it has a waxy consistency that's difficult to clean out of brushes. I'm transforming a second pipe with silver rub and buff, but I'm adding a little bit of antique gold to create more depth and a tarnished look. To age these two pieces, I'm adding a black wash using black acrylic paint and rubbing alcohol. I had to Google it to know what it's called, but I have this laser cut wood planchette from a Ouija board. This is the little piece people put their fingers on to move around the board to reveal the numbers and letters. I started out by aging the piece, adding black around the edges, and finished it with some antique wax for a stained look. I'm adding this antique photo in a metal frame unaltered and using this key on the right that aged naturally so it's no longer shiny brass. On a recent beach trip I found some fish spines, so I'll be using these in the display as well. To create labels for my creepy goodies, I'm aging some paper. I'm starting by adding some watered down brown acrylic paint to the surface and dabbing away the excess so there aren't brush streaks. I dipped a stiff bristled brush into some watered down black paint to splatter over the surface to mimic the look of mold. I'm cutting out a teeny tiny strip to make sure my labels are in scale and don't take up too much visual space. In retrospect, I should have aged the entire sheet of paper, so when I'm doing future projects, I won't have to stop to age paper and can instead just carry on crafting and use my existing stash. I'm elevating this pretty plain piece of paper using a brown marker. This not only adds contrast and age, but it takes away from the uniformity of the perfect cut because the bleeding ink creates a scalloped type of border. I used this extremely tiny 005 art pen to write words. I intended to use the Latin names, but I accidentally typed Italian instead, so everything is written in Italian. To finish the labels, I'm cutting them out one at a time and using a marker to finish the cut ends. These are very tiny and get blown away easily, so maybe store them in something with sides. To make it less fiddly, I'm coloring the end of the next label before I cut it out and then coloring the newly cut end. I colored the entire perimeter prior to cutting any of the labels out because it's a lot easier to do this all at once rather than try to color 4 sides of a teeny tiny label after the fact. I'm adding my first piece directly to the center, so I'm finding the middle of the inside of my table by adding a strip of paper and folding it in half. This is one of my go-to methods to avoid measuring. I'm adding the frog using some Beacon 3-in-1, making sure to leave space above it to add the paper label. I pre-planned the layout and took a picture of my phone prior to gluing in any of the pieces. Consider joining my Patreon either as a free member or as a paying member for $3 a month, and make sure you check out this video next.